Hello, what are you reading?
Hi, it's the Holy Qur'an.
But isn't the Quran only for Muslims?
Not at all. Its teachings are addressed to all humanity, from heads of state to everyday people like us.
What does it teach us?
It's a book of life for life. No thinking person should pass through life without it.
Where can I get a copy?
From the IPCI, 124 Queen Street, Durban.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Sadaqallah. Sadaqallahu azim. What we're going to discuss with this morning, Zionism and its implications in terms of world affairs and world politics. We'll see how that permeates society. Now, what do you see here behind you? We see there, what do we see? Someone tells me, what do we see there? The Star of David. That's something which was amalgamated and appropriated by Judaism during the Middle Ages, and it became associated with Jewry, and today wherever you go around the world, anything that is even mildly representative of Judaism has that particular sign, the Star of David. In the middle, you have there an individual who's the ideologue, someone called Theodor Herzl, the founder of what we call Zionism today. Now, if someone were to ask you, someone comes to you and he tells you, tell me, what is Zionism? What does Zionism mean? Zion, where does it come from? Where does it originate? And I believe that when you basically want to determine anything on any issue, you need to go to the source. If I want to find something about Christianity, where would you look? Where do you look? Anything about Christianity and you want to study Christianity, what's your starting point? What's the reference point? The Bible. You look at this particular book, the Holy Bible. Here I've got in my hand a copy of the King James Version, the Holy Bible. If I want to know something about the Qur'an, or you go to the about Islam, you go to the Holy Qur'an. If I want to know something about Hinduism, you go to the either the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads or the Hindu scriptures. So it stands to reason, if you know anything about Zionism, then you need to go to its source. You can't go to the Old Testament because the Old Testament is silent on the term Zionism as an ideology. So you need to now go back and look at secular literature. You need to look at encyclopedias. You need to look at books which deal with a particular subject. One of the key books which deal with the subject on Zionism is what we call the Encyclopedia Hebraica, or the Jewish Encyclopedia. The Jewish, or the Encyclopedia Hebraica, it defines Zionism, and it states in inverted commas, it speaks about it as a Jewish national movement emerging at the end of the 19th century with the object, forgive the horrible spelling there because there's a problem, I think I was working on these slides late last night, and perhaps in my sleep-induced state, I might have made one or two spelling mistakes which I never picked up. But basically speaking, you can take this down, it's with the object of returning the people of Israel to their historical homeland, in the land of Israel, drawing its inspiration from the vision of the return to Jerusalem, which has impacted on the history of Israel. So what it basically tells us is that it's a movement. Zionism is a movement for what? It's a movement to call people towards this idea of going and creating this nation state. Nation state, nationalism. So it's nationalism. What is nationalism? Anyone tells me what's nationalism? Nationalism is the idea of creating nation state, nationhood, nationalistic. Like, for example, someone may argue or debate, the ANC, even in its struggle period, was highly nationalistic. The black consciousness movement, on the other hand, was not nationalistic. It went beyond nationalism because it dealt with aspects of society where it basically never subsumed to the whole idea of a geographically bound nation state. Islam is not something which can be confined to a geographically bound nation state. So when you speak about an Islamic state, it becomes an oxymoron. You can't have Islam subsumed within the confines of a geographically bound nation state. Zionism, on the other hand, champions nationhood. It champions nationalism. It's something which is insular, something which is exclusive. It's an exclusive concept. Islam is not exclusive, it's inclusive. It includes people of every race. Open to Surah 49 verse 13, what do you read? Ya ayyuhan nasu, O mankind, O humanity, inna khalaqnakum min zakari wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu. O humanity, we created you from a single pair and made you into nations and tribes that you may recognize each other, not that you may despise each other. And it goes on to say, most certainly, the most exalted of you in the sight of God is he who is most righteous in conduct. Not your race, not your lineage, not your... Someone says he comes from Lesotho. Who comes from Lesotho? The brother comes from Lesotho. There you have a monarch, King Mswati. That's something which is an anathema to Islam, because the concept of a monarchy, Islam comes to do away with the concept of a monarchy. It doesn't recognize monarchy. It doesn't recognize that people need to hold elite positions as a result of their particular lineage. It envisages an egalitarian system, a system where there's equality across the board. There's no monarchy. What for? Why do you want to have some monarch ruling over you? You create a society which is just, which is egalitarian. Therefore, perhaps, maybe the most system, although you can't, it's full with flaws, but a system that might be parallel or could be least acceptable within the Islamic framework is a socialist system. At least socialist, the democrat socialism or socialist democracy. Not socialist communism, what you saw in the Stalinist version of Russia or the USSR, but the kind of socialism which you see in Venezuela, where people, one of the only countries in the world where the wealth of the state is being shared by the masses, the oil wealth. Education is free, healthcare is free, it's open to the masses, something which you don't find in many countries. So perhaps the Latin American varieties, the Latin American countries are something which we as Muslims can aspire to and can basically look to as practical examples of what we see around the world. Zionism is something which is insular, something which is closed. Now, one should not confuse Zionism with Judaism. Why do I say that? Because there are many Jews in the world today that would be opposed to Zionism. For example, in the IPCI in December, we had a group of ultra-Orthodox rabbis called the Neturei Karta. This is ultra-Orthodox rabbis. They won't even eat your food. And they are hell-bent opposed to the Zionist principle, the Zionist ideology, because they say this is something which they cannot recognize. The violence that is permeated by Zionism, they cannot recognize within the aspects of Judaism. In fact, Judaism in itself is also an artificial construct. It's a religion. Judaism is a religion. Zionism is a political ideology. Many Zionists are in fact Jews, but many Jews are not necessarily Zionists. Many Zionists themselves are even atheists, but they claim they are basically supporting the Jewish ideology or the Jewish way of life, but in reality they're atheists. So know this, that Zionism is a Jewish national movement emerging at the end of the 19th century with the Zionist object of returning the people to Israel and the historical homeland in the land of Israel, drawing its inspiration from the vision of the return to Jerusalem, which has impacted on the history of Israel. You know the story of Moses, taking the people from Egypt, out of the Egyptian bondage, to the promised land. That's the kind of idea they have appropriated for themselves, these atheists, and they claim this is what they want to create. Now, You expand it further, what's it based on? It's based on the foundation of the historical ties and religious traditions linking the Jewish people to the land of Israel, where the concept of Jewish nationhood first evolved somewhere between 1200 BC and the Second Temple era. That's up until the time of Jesus. Because there was an idea. You see, if you look at the Old Testament, there was a promise made to the people, the children of Israel, that they would be taken out of the Egyptian bondage and taken to a land where they would live in peace and security. But that promise fell away. You heard of Shylock wanting his pound of flesh. What did it create? It created the idea of an individual who was conniving, someone who wanted his pound of flesh, someone who didn't think twice, someone who's manipulative. Now, that idea permeated European society. They saw these Jewish people, they are parasites. They are people who want to take away our land. They want to take away our wealth. They want to take over the economy. And by and large, many Jews did in fact. I mean, you look at the Rothschild banking dynasty. Many of them were secular Jews. You look at many Jewish individuals in history, even to the extent that Martin Luther, the reformer Martin Luther, stated in one of his writings that there has never existed a people who have been more bloodthirsty than the Jewish people. That's a statement. That's not something that we as Muslims need to promote, but this is what people in Europe viewed Jews. There was a hatred towards Jewish people. There was a hatred towards Jews in general. What they call anti-Semitism. Now, there is a problem with that. Because when you look at anti-Semitism, anyone tell me, what's anti-Semitism? What's a Semite? Semite is Semitic, coming from the word Semitic. Semitic means people who come from the Middle Eastern region. Those were the Semites. Like the Arabs, like the Jews who lived there, like those who basically form part and parcel of the Middle Eastern region, the Semites. Now, unfortunately, Jews appropriated the term, European Jews appropriated the term anti-Semite or anti-Semitism. For example, when you showed discrimination towards European Jews because they were Jewish, they said, look, you're anti-Semitic. And that anti-Semitism, it's become like a wand where they've just simply labeled anyone. If you say something against Israel, you're an anti-Semite. But it's a label. But in reality, I'll just show you the flaw about this. Because Semites are people who are part of the Middle Eastern region, like the Arabs, like the Jews who live there, like the Ethiopian Jews, the Sephardic Jews. Judaism and Jews, as you have here, it's not a race. Like African people, you are a race. Indian is a race. White people, they are a race. Aborigines, it's a race. Jews are not a race. They are religious. In fact, they are a religious grouping of people. You have Japanese Jews. You have Chinese Jews. You have Jews who basically come from Africa. You have European Jews, and so on. This particular Jewish people who we were talking about, who are controlling the mantles of power, are who? European Jews. And where do they come from? According to some writers, Arthur Koestler, he says, he's a Jewish writer himself, according to his research, he states that the Jewish people have no historical claim to the land of Israel. He says they are not the biblical Hebrews, and certainly they are not Semites. They don't originate from biblical Israel, but from a Sumerian people who became known as the Khazars in what became southern Russia and the Caucasus Mountain. Today their lands are largely occupied by Georgia. This is why the so-called Jewish nose, you know, the Jewish nose is not a genetic trait of Israel, but the Caucasus. So they come from a region called Khazaria, which is in the Khazar Mountains, in the Caucasus region, the Caucasians, European, whites. They come from that particular area. And as such, they are not Semites, they are Europeans. They are near the Russian region. And then they subsequently moved to places like Poland, to places like Germany, and they settled in those regions. And as a result of that, they became part and parcel of the system. So if you label anyone who criticizes them as anti-Semites, that would be wrong, because the term Semite refers to someone who comes from the Middle Eastern region. The Ethiopian Jews, the black Jews, African Jews from Ethiopia. In Israel today, they're at the lowest level of the table. Why? They're Jewish. Why are they placed down right in the bottom? In terms of their access to healthcare, in terms of their access to social justice, in terms of their access to education. Why are they right at the bottom of the ladder? It's because they are Africans. Has this water come from the well?
Yes.
It's not, doesn't have any, is it pure well water?
From the bottom.
Okay. It's because of the idea that you're Africans, you're blacks, so you have no rights in society. So anyone now who discriminates against Israel or any discrimination against Jews, what are they talking about? They are talking about white Jews. You can't discriminate against white Jews, the European Jews, the Khazars. Those who are not Semites, but they claim that if you criticize them, you are an anti-Semite. But they're not Semites, they come from Europe. Black Jews, yes, well, who cares about you? The Ethiopian Jews, they're at the bottom. And right in the bottom you have the Palestinians. So, know this. The recreation of a Jewish national homeland was also strongly advocated by American scholars such as Louis Brandeis as a solution to this Jewish problem and a way to revive the Jewish spirit. That's the background which we have. Now, where does this come from? Or where did it develop? You see, the whole idea behind Zionism is that you must look at it as a political movement. It's not a religious movement, it's a political movement. Like apartheid, was it religious? It wasn't religious, although they got backing from the Dutch Reformed Church and from the clergy in South Africa, but it was not something which was religiously ordained. Many Christians will tell you it has no basis within Christianity, even though Christianity was used as a basis to implement apartheid. Similarly, Zionism is a political movement, and it's established by an Austro-Hungarian journalist. Again, Hungary. Hungary was near the Caucasus Mountains, Eastern Europe. European Jew. His name was Theodor Herzl, and Theodor Herzl was a Jew. He came from a Jewish origin, but he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God, but he used Judaism as a means for promoting his philosophy. In the late 19th century, he published a book called Der Judenstaat. German or Austrian. What's it called? It's called the Jewish state. And the movement seeks to encourage Jewish migration to the land of Israel and was eventually successful in establishing Israel in 1948 as what? As a homeland for the Jewish people. Its proponents regard its aim as self-determination for the Jewish people. The percentage of world Jewry living in Israel has basically grown, and so they've increased. How? Not through birth, but through migration. People now come from America. That's why you have lots of Americans who come and settle there. American Jews, European Jews from Germany, European Jews from Poland. Today, roughly 40% of the world's Jews live in Israel. A similar number live in the United States. And we look at the discussion of American Jews. So, know this, it's a political movement. It was created by Theodor Herzl, that's him. This is the man behind it. He has a big bushy beard, but in reality he was not Jewish. He was an atheist. He comes from Austro-Hungary. He wrote a piece like Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. He wrote the Jewish state ideologue, and suddenly he propounded people must move. They must move to settle in Israel. So this idea of Jews being settled in Israel developed when? In the 19th century. In the 1800s, the late 1800s, there was a conference which was held in Basel. This notion that we have, that it was only after Hitler exterminated the Jews in the Second World War, then only was Israel created, is not entirely correct, because this was already in the pipeline. This was in the pipeline a long time ago. And what had happened in Nazi Germany was merely a kind of a prelude to the ongoing plans that was already planned in place. So that's the man behind the system. He was, as the Paris correspondent, he was a journalist, he was a paper, he had written quite extensively called the New Freie Presse, or the so-called Free Press. And following the Dreyfus affair, which was an affair which had taken place in subsequently during that time period, it was an incident which occurred in France in which a French Jewish army captain, he was accused of falsely spying for Germany. He was viewed as a spy, and mass rallies were witnessed following the Dreyfus trial, because as a result, when he was a Jewish French captain, a Jewish army captain, and because he was accused about spying for Germany, imagine that he was spying for Germany even though he was a Jewish French army captain. As a result of that, people called out for his blood. They said this man needs to be put to death. Death to Jews. And so from that idea it gave birth to this whole notion where people now saw Jewish people as a troublesome community, as a troublesome group of individuals. And so Herzl thereafter came to reject his early ideas regarding Jewish emancipation and assimilation, where he stated initially that, look, these Jews need to be assimilated into the system. Now he said that Jews must remove themselves entirely from Europe and they need to form their own state. But it was a political movement. And I'll tell you why as we go on later. Even people like David Ben-Gurion, because people asked them, they said, look, if you want to create a separate, you want to save Jewish people, why don't you just transport them to England? They would be at peace. But these people said no. One of the first prime ministers of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, and we'll look at the quotation, he said that if he had the choice, he would rather sacrifice close to 500 to 600,000 Jews. Let them all die, he doesn't care. But it's important that the state of Israel remains alive, the concept remains alive. Because it's an ideological movement for wealth, for power, to take over land. If you can take over land of the Middle East, what can you do? You can have control for the next few centuries. You can control the entire region. And you can create wars upon wars. It sustains your business, it sustains the industry. So the whole aim wasn't basically to save the Jewish people. It was something which was politically, something which was monetary aligned, and something which was there for personal gain. In fact, if you look at history, some people will tell you that some of the Jewish elites in Germany were never exterminated by Nazis. Why not? Why is it that those who were killed were only the poorer segments of Jewish society? And the basic people who were like the gypsies were killed, homosexuals were killed, Jews were killed. But the poorer Jews, the elite Jews, the bankers, like the Rothschild families, why weren't they exterminated? Because some researchers have said that they even worked together with the Nazi war machine to create the system in place for mass migration to what was then Israel. In June 1895, Theodor Herzl, the same man, he wrote in his diary, "In Paris, as I have said, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism. Above all, I recognize the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism." So what's he saying? Anti-Semitism is what? Hatred towards people who are Semitic. They appropriated for themselves and they said, look, if you hate us, you are an anti-Semite. Now he's saying, well, who cares about that? Why are we worried? If people are hating us, who cares about that? This is futile. It's futile to go on fighting. So this is what I propose. In his book, Der Judenstaat, he writes, "The Jewish question persists wherever Jews live in appreciable numbers. Wherever it does not exist, it is brought together with Jewish immigrants. We are naturally drawn into those places where we are not persecuted, and our appearance there gives rise to persecution. This is the case, and will inevitably be so everywhere, even in highly civilized countries. See, for instance, France, so long as the Jewish question is not solved on the political level. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism in England. They have already introduced it into America. The system is going to persist, it's going to continue. And therefore, this was one of the first conferences in the 1800s, I think in the 1890s, where they met together and they had the World Conference. In fact, in this particular book that I've got here, it's called Apartheid Israel by Dr. Yuri Davis. He had come to the IPCI, I think probably was in 2000, 2001, and he had discussed this entire meeting At this meeting, and who attends this meeting? Look at the people who are attending the meeting. Not peasants. These are the elite class who attended this meeting. And at this meeting, there was a plan in place, strategized to say, as of now, we are basically laying the foundation for the creation of a Jewish state, a world conference in Basel. On the second day of its deliberations, that was on August 30th, the version submitted to the Congress by a committee under the chair of Max Nordau, and it was stated, Zionism seeks to establish home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. They wanted it introduced in the legislation. He said this gave clear expression to Herzl's political Zionism in contrast with the settlement-orientated activities of the more loosely organized Hovivi Zion. To meet halfway the request of numerous delegates, the most prominent of whom was Leo Morskin, who sought the inclusion of the phrase, by international law, a compromise formula proposed by Herzl was eventually adopted. Now you see what they did. They had this conference. And at the conference they said that, look, this idea of establishing a state should not be now just an isolated idea. It must be introduced in legislation. It must be introduced in law. If we can introduce it in law, what was then subsequently the League of Nations, and then it became the United Nations, if we can have this established in law, if we can get backing by the League of Nations, which later became the United Nations, then it will create legitimacy for us to establish this particular state. And that's what happened. So at this particular conference, they laid the brainchild for what was proposed to happen. And this political program, which became known as the Basel program, it laid out Zionism's goal. It was adopted in the following terms. It says the formulation of the Zionist platform, the foundation of the World Zionist Organization. Hadvika, what's the Hadvika? It's like an anthem. It's like a Jewish anthem as a theme. The absorption of most Zion societies. Creation of government grants. We will have governments, we'll make them subservient to us for decades, for centuries, which are necessary for the Zionist purpose. So that's what we are looking for, an ongoing system of perpetual debt. And so they created that. What was then adopted as a symbol for Zionism, and so they adopted the Jewish symbol, Star of David. An appropriated concept. Now, subsequently what had happened was, we'll just try and skip this slide. If you look at Zionism as it stands, there are different categories of Zionists. That's what you must understand. You have, for example, labor Zionists. What are labor Zionists? Labor Zionists, it's a system or it's a movement. It originated in Eastern Europe. Socialist Zionists believed that centuries of being oppressed in anti-Semitic societies had reduced Jews to a meek, vulnerable, despairing existence, which invited further and further anti-Semitism. The more poorer you are, the more people will hate you. They argued that a revolution of the Jewish soul and society was necessary and achievable in part by Jews moving to Israel and becoming farmers, workers, and soldiers in country of their own. Most socialist Zionists rejected the observance of traditional religious Judaism as perpetuating a diaspora mentality amongst the Jewish people, and established rural communes in Israel called kibbutzim. So they said, forget about all these festivities that we have, kibbutz and all the rest. We need to go back to the core. We need to take over the land. We need to take over the economy. We need to become self-subservient, have our own plantations, own developments. Because Israel was barren, although there was a civilization and there was a community that lived there for some time. But they were particularly barren. Though socialist Zionism draws its inspiration and it's philosophically founded on the fundamental values and spirituality of Judaism, its progressive expression of the Judaism has often fostered an antagonistic relationship with Orthodox Judaism, which means that by and large, even though labor Zionist state that look, they espouse many of the spiritual philosophies of Judaism. By and large, they are not. They are not in tune with the Jewish system. They don't support the Jewish system. They are more pragmatic in their approach. Therefore, you have today, who's the party? The Labour Party, under Ariel Sharon. More interested in economic wealth, economic growth. Then you have liberal Zionists. Who are the liberal Zionists? Liberal Zionism was initially a trend within the Zionist movement from the first Zionist Congress. You know that picture I showed you? The first Zionist Congress at Basel. That's the same picture in 1897 after the First World War. And these people here, they basically identified with who? Not with the working class. They identified with the bourgeoisie, the so-called liberal class, which many Zionist leaders, like people like Theodor Herzl, people like Chaim Weizmann, for example. These were people who were from the upper elite class, those who were part of the banking system, the big business, the Rothschild family, the Rothschild banking dynasty. Those were from that particular category. Liberal Zionism, although not associated with any single modern party in Israel, remains strong trends in Israeli politics because it advocates free market principles. You know what the free market is? What's a free market? It's a system of capitalism, rampant capitalism. What system does South Africa advocate?
Socialist.
Do we advocate socialism? In talk, yes. But in principle, it's a free market. It's a capitalist enterprise. Why did they put prepaid water meters in Alexandra Township and Soweto? What for? Prepaid water meters, prepaid electricity. Public healthcare is bad, shoddy. Private healthcare is the only way, if you want to basically get better, you go to private healthcare, private hospitals. Because it embraces a free market. It's a capitalist system. It's part of the global system. They've sold the people out. Similarly, liberal Zionists embrace that free market system. Democracy and adherence to human rights in principle, but in reality they don't. Because a free market can never advocate human rights. It's free for who? Free for a selected group, free for multinationals, free for certain industrialists, not free for the masses. Then we go on to nationalist Zionists. Who are nationalist Zionists? Nationalist Zionists, they come from people like the historical, people like the revisionist, people like Vladimir Jabotinsky. Remember the name? They left the World Zionist. They were part and parcel of the World Zionist Organization, but they left the World Zionist Organization in 1935. Why? Because it refused to state that the creation of the Jewish state was an objective of Zionism. They didn't want to. They wanted to make it. They basically was against that particular principle. The revisionists, they advocated the formation of a Jewish army in Palestine. Why? To force the Arab population to accept mass Jewish migration. In fact, they evolved into what we call the Likud party. You heard of the Likud party in Israel today, which dominated most governments since 1977 up until now. Up until now, it still advocates Israel maintaining control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Even though some of the more liberal segments will say, look, West Bank and Gaza belong to Palestine. These guys who left the World Zionist Organization in 1935 and they subsequent metamorphosing into various other factions, up until now they hold West Bank and East Jerusalem and they take a hardline approach in the Israeli-Arab conflict. They say not just Israel, but even parts of Jordan, even parts of Egypt need to now basically form part of Israel. All of this need to form what they call Eretz Israel, Greater Israel belonging to us. And in 2005, we had the split which was taking place, where the Likud party split over the issue of the creation of a Palestinian state on the occupied territories. Because one faction stated, look, there needs to be a Palestinian state. Another faction states peace talks need to be developed with the Kadima party. And that helped form the Kadima party. So they were split into two separate factions. But fundamentally, they are a hardline organization. Now, who do we have here? Here we have an individual which shows us that not all people supported this idea. We have before me an individual called Asher Ginsberg, or Ahad Ha'am, led by Asher Ginsberg. He was one of the primary opponents to political Zionism up until 1948 inside the Zionist movement. And he was part of what we call the school of spiritual Zionism. They believe, look, the state of Israel was something which needed to be a spiritual idea, not something which was physically by means of the creation of the state. And so the efforts to establish a Jewish state was it was led by political Zionists. The effort to oppose the creation of the state of Israel was the idea of people like the spiritual Zionists, people who were opposed by it. They formed the Hebrew University in Jerusalem that was led by spiritual Zionists, not by those who were political Zionists. Writing in the Hebrew newspaper Haaretz in June 1891, he says, "From abroad we are accustomed to believe that Eretz Israel is presently almost desolate and uncultivated desert, and that anyone wishing to buy land there can come and buy all he wants. But in truth, this is not so. In the entire land," look what he says, because we were given to understand that the land was untillable. There was no tilling done. The Jews are required to develop the land. But look at what he says. He's a spiritual Zionist. He says, "In truth, it is hard to find a tillable land that is not already tilled. Only sandy fields and stony hills, suitable at best for planting trees of vine, and even that after considerable work and expense and cleaning and preparing them." So he says that, look, there was a society. You have an existing community there. I didn't put the pictures, I never had time for this. Maybe in the future I'll bring them along. Where you have communities developed communities living. People had their own culture, their own societies, their own communities. Existing Jews and Palestinians and Arabs living side to side. Not European Jews, existing Jews, who were Arab Jews in actual fact, living side to side. So they were questioning, why are you trying to break the system? To what end? Why do you want to break a system which is already in place and create so much of division? And he was in the end, of course, put into a ban, struck aside. Now, these are some of the questions we need to ask. The critical question with regards to political Zionism is not whether it represents the aspirations or the liberation of the Jewish people, but whether it is a settler colonial movement whose actions need to be questioned. And what do you think? What do you guys think? Is it a settler colonial movement, or is it a movement which represents the aspirations and liberations of Jewish people? It's a secular colonial movement. Many Jews oppose it. And so we need to, for example, you have groups in Europe like the Jews for Justice, the Neturei Karta in New York. Some of them are ultra-Orthodox Jews which are opposed, hell-bent to the whole system of what Zionism advocates. Something which is settler colonial, something which is sustaining the Western imperial tradition, and something which is insular and basically against human rights. In fact, the UN Declaration of Human Rights declared it as a crime against humanity. Sometimes these Jews use biblical references to justify their position. Even though you ask them, do you believe in God? They'll say no. They don't believe in God. But they use biblical references to establish their claims. They would cite the Amalekite massacre. You heard of the Amalekite massacre? Anyone heard of the Amalekite massacre? You look at the Old Testament, the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 3, or even the books of Joshua. You open up 1 Samuel 15 verse 3, there we read that God Almighty, He tells Saul what they did, what Amalek did to Israel some 4,000 years before, 400 years before. He says, now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but kill both man, woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. You kill them all. Even donkeys are not spared. 1 Samuel 15 verse 3 of the Old Testament. Then you look at the books of Joshua in the Old Testament. The wars of conquest of Joshua, where they slaughtered people, they massacred people. and they conquered land after land after land after land. Conquests, murder, rape, killing, ongoing, and these people justified. Some of the settlers justify their position based on the Bible, based on the Old Testament, based on the warfare we find in the Old Testament. Therefore, not surprisingly, the UN Declaration of Human Rights declared it as a crime against humanity. Bloodshed, ongoing sustained bloodshed. Anyone sees this man before? Who's he? Anyone knows him? Never heard of him before? He's someone who we call, you heard of the Balfour Declaration?
Yes.
Huh? What's the Balfour Declaration about? Someone tell me what the Balfour Declaration is about. You see, as we noted above, we stated that the political objectives of the first World Zionist Organization were defined in August in 1897 at the first Congress in Basel, that's in Switzerland. Now this is what it said. It says the aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. Remember that. The Zionist movement, that was the idea, but it won its first crucial international political recognition in the 1970 Balfour Declaration, submitted by the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur James Balfour. That's him. He's Lord Arthur James Balfour, to his compatriot. Who was his compatriot? The banking magnate Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild. What was the Balfour Declaration? It was just a letter. The Balfour Declaration was a letter in which the Foreign Office, Lord Arthur James Balfour, wrote a letter to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, in which the British Empire committed itself to the Zionist objectives in the following terms. And where's the letter? This is a letter. He just wrote a letter. And that letter became known as a Balfour Declaration. Imagine that. It's like one particular person writing a letter to another person, and that becomes a declaration for our government. Foreign Office wrote a letter to a banking magnate, Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild. This is the Balfour Declaration. What did it say? Lord Arthur James Balfour, this guy here, he writes to him, he says, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation." These guys are now saying, look, we are aware of what the position is. The position is as follows. We control Palestine, but we are aware of your needs and aspirations. We are aware of the anti-Semitism against Jewish people in Europe. Now we're making a declaration to Palestine, we're going to give it to you. And he writes it in the form of a letter to Lord Rothschild. And in it he says that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish people. Their political status will remain unchanged. Did that happen? Did their political status remain unchanged, the Palestinians? Tell me. It changed drastically. We saw genocide upon genocide. Look at this. What do we see here? This is a group called Irgun. Irgun Zwei Lumi Be'eres Israel. Irgun. I'm just trying to open up a particular issue here. An organization called Irgun. what had happened here was these so-called Jewish people, the Zionists, the Ashkenazi, they call them the Ashkenazi, the Khazars. After the war, after the Second World War, because you saw there was the Holocaust in Israel, in Germany, which had taken place. There was a Holocaust in Germany. Not just Jews were killed, but Gypsies, other people were killed. And then subsequently there was this transfer of people coming to the land of Israel. Now after the war, leading Zionist fronts continued to support right-wing groups or ignore their actions when it suits them. Canadian Greg Fulton, who is a writer, this is what he says. You see, because the idea we normally get is that Nazis were against the Jews, and so these Jews had to leave and they had to form Palestine, and they had to form Israel. That's the idea, you get that. But look at the reality. The reality is that many Zionists, in fact, even supported the Nazis. Germany, the Zionists themselves, who were supposedly helping the Jewish people, they supported the Nazis. This is what the writer says. He says, Israel would not be possible today if the World Zionist Congress and other Zionist agencies hadn't formed common cause with Hitler's exterminators to rid Europe of Jews, in exchange for helping round up non-Zionist Jews, sabotage Jewish resistance movements, and betray the trust of Jews. The Zionists secured for themselves safe passage to Palestine. This arrangement was formalized in a number of emigration agreements signed in 1938. The most notorious case of Zionist collusion concerned Dr. Rudolf Kastner, chairman of the Zionist organization in Hungary from 1943 to 1945. To secure the safe passage of 600 Zionists to Palestine, he helped Nazis